I'm Don Ostrowski, and I wanted to thank Cheryl Egan Donovan for linking me up with this with the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship and this virtual meeting, and Earl Showerman for allowing me to make this presentation. This is a comparison of someone you've heard of, Shakespeare, and someone you may not have heard of, Prince Andrei Kurbskii, and the relative authorship controversies associated with them. And if you would like more information, that you can read my book. It has a chapter on the Shakespeare controversy and a chapter on the Kurbskii controversy. But what I am going to present today is something that did not appear in the book. It was something that I had written up, but it did not work out when I was reducing both of these controversies to chapter form. So we'll start off by saying, okay, on the left, that is not Shakespeare, and on the right, that's not Andrei Kurbskii. However, many of you are familiar with the Ashburton portrait. At one time claimed to be Shakespeare, but has since been refuted. And on the right is an actor who is playing Andrei Kurbskii in the film Ivan the Terrible. The point being that everything is not what it might appear to be or what people say that it is. On the left here, we're pretty sure this is a portrait of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. And I want to make the point clear that both in the book and in my presentation today, I am not arguing for or against any particular author for the Shakespeare canon or for the Kurbskiana. I'm interested in analyzing what the types of arguments and evidence used has been for the ultimate purpose of creating a field of authorship studies in general. On the right, Queen Elizabeth, pretty sure that's a portrait of her, representative of the 76 other claimants or so for the mantle of having written the Shakespearean canon. So, purpose of the lecture, establish the main points of contention, extrapolate rules of attribution, if possible. Not, as I said, not to establish whether William of Stratford or Andrei Kurbskii or anyone else wrote those works, but to also encourage scholars who are involved in authorship studies in their own field to venture beyond their own fields, their own silos, as I call them, and look at authorship controversies in other fields, because it can be quite enlightening. So 12 main points of comparison here. And I won't go through each of these now because I will be going through each of these in detail. So alternate spellings. Now, to be sure, Ariana is not a surname, it's a first name, but it's just to give an idea of the various ways that a very straightforward name can be spelled. So I've divided each of these 12 discussion points into anti-Stratfordian, Stratfordian, and Oxfordian in regard to the Shakespeare controversy. And for the Kurbskii controversy, I just tried to present what the latest understanding in the field is. So the anti-Stratfordians are very strong on the spelling of the name Shakespeare or Shakespeare, even to the point of saying it's a different name. it's not the same thing. And also the fact that many times on the title pages, there's a hyphen, the name is hyphenated, which would seem to indicate a pseudonym. Stratfordians say these are normal Elizabethan spelling variants, and it proves nothing. And they also point out that there are people whose own names, not pseudonyms, have also been hyphenated. I think Ross Barber has dealt with that in her book. So the Oxfordian position is that Shakespeare, the pseudonym comes from Gabriel Harvey's addressing Edward de Vere as thy countenance Shakespeare's, an allusion to Athena. But there also is a problem with, or has been raised, a problem has been raised in regard to Andrei Kurbskii, because he signed his will with Kurbskii, which is the reducing the plosive, the voiced plosive be to a voiceless plosive pa. And Ned Keenan, historian at Harvard, said this is analphabetic, basically an illiterate phonetic transcription, because his village was Kurba, and if he was the scholar that people say he was, he would have known that. Relevance, I don't see much relevance here, little or no. People use different names in writing. They spell their names differently. If Edward de Vere could have used Shakespeare as a pseudonym, why couldn't William of Stratford use it as a pseudonym? It's Kurbskii also, I don't see much relevance here, because it is the phonetic spelling, and he is spelling it in the Latin alphabet as opposed to the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, he, in a court document, said that he couldn't write Cyrillic, which is an interesting point for someone that so much in Cyrillic has been attributed to. But the proponents say, oh, he was lying in the court document that he couldn't write Cyrillic. In any case, we do see examples of people who, in going from one language to another, even in the same language, spelling their names in different ways, often, sometimes unrecognizable. How about name on the title page of works attributed to him? And this is from Shakespeare's sonnets, hyphenated, to be sure. The anti-Stratfordian position is the idea that William of Stratford wrote the plays first arose in 1623. The editors of the first folio hinted at it, and except for the similarity in name, there's nothing that connects William of Stratford with the composition of the plays, sonnets or long poems. There is an acknowledgement he may have been a theater broker, and he might have been an actor, but the composition of these works is what the anti-Stratfordians are getting at. Stratfordians say many plays published separately in quarto in Shakespeare's lifetime with the name William Shakespeare shows that William Shakespeare wrote them, and that he was the writer of them. It's a bit of a circular argument, which I'll circle back to later. The Oxfordian position is that a number of plays, such as Sir John Oldcastle, London Prodigal, and Yorkshire Tragedy, were published with the name William Shakespeare on the title page, but the Stratfordians don't accept that their man wrote the plays. And a number of Oxfordians have said this indicates that William Shakespeare, that name, was a pseudonym, because other people used it. In terms of attributions to Kurbskii, this is a rather complex issue, because what we have in 3 letters that he supposedly wrote to Ivan the Terrible, he identifies himself as Andrei Kurbskii, but these manuscripts date no earlier than the 1620s, and he presumably died in the 1580s. So, but that's not a big problem. These could be later copies of earlier works. The main works that are attributed to Kurbskii, like the History of the Grand Prince of Moscow, History of the Eighth Council, and so forth, translations that he supposedly made, not only from Eusebius and from Chrysostom, but from Cicero and so forth. There's no attribution in the manuscripts. So how did these works get attributed to him? And possibility is that there's recent work by Konstantin Yerushalimsky on something called the Miscellany, or Spornik in Russian, Spornik, Miscellany of Kurbskii, in which the letters appear, as well as some of these other works as well. So Yerushalimsky doesn't say that that is the cause of their being attributed to Kurbskii. He thinks Kurbskii wrote them, by the way. He's a proponent of it. And also in the preface to Novi Marguerite, or New Pearl, the attribution occurs to Kurbskii, occurs in one manuscript copy of the early 18th century, no earlier than that. And the attribution of translation from John of Damascus also dates to the 18th century. So here is the miscellany broken down, give you a sense of the convoy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are the recensions. So the first recension has HGPM, which is the History of the Grand Prince of Moscow, and then K1, 2, 3 are the 3 letters that are attributed to Kurbskii that he wrote to Ivan the Terrible. The recension 2 has other items that are also attributed to Kurbskii added. Recension 3, 4, and 5 have additional items not attributed to Kurbskii. And to break this down a bit further, these are the 3 works, 3 letters, that have definite attributions to Andrei Kurbskii, and intended that it be understood that Kurbskii wrote them. These Lithuanian letters, it's Polish-Lithuanian letters, some of them, about half of them, have attribution to Andrei Kurbskii, and the other half don't. And then everything above the line has been attributed to Andrei Kurbskii, whether and without an attribution on the manuscripts, and everything below the line has not been attributed to him. So there's the basic puzzle. That's just the breakdown. This is to give you the attribution within the miscellany of Kurbskii. Those items in bold have no attribution, but they are still nonetheless attributed to Kurbskii. All right, relevance. Well, significant relevance, but not decisive. Sometimes contemporary, near contemporary attributions can be mistaken. But if there is such an attribution, a contemporary or near contemporary attribution, then the burden is on those who disagree with that attribution. The scholars who disagree, the burden is on them to show that that attribution is incorrect. If there's no such attribution, contemporary or near contemporary, then the burden is on those who want to attribute a particular work to a particular author. And with Andrei Kurbskii, that has not occurred. It's just been accepted that he wrote everything that's been attributed, or almost everything that was attributed to him. Okay, literacy of family. William, anti-Stratfordians point out, William Stratford's parents, wife, daughters were probably illiterate. And the Stratfordians say so. That shows the anti-Stratfordians are snobs. And the Oxfordian position, is, well, Earl of Oxford was well placed with family connections who were not only literate but very talented. And Lord Burleigh had one of the finest libraries in England. Arthur Golding, his uncle, translated Ovid's Metamorphoses, which were used in the plays. So he's well connected in terms of family. Kurbskii, no evidence of literacy of his family. So relevance. Well, some relevance, but depends to a great extent on what's being written. If someone's writing a memoir, then it doesn't matter too much whether their family was literate. One might question whether they were literate enough to write the memoir, which has occurred, by the way, in other cases. But writing a memoir is not dependent on family literacy. Gandhi's wife was probably illiterate, but all four of his sons were literate, and he wrote about politics, personal matters. No literary works, however. Going outside of the literary realm into the musical realm, Bach, Mozart, I could add Beethoven here, many other composers, Bach's sons, including, all came from musical families. And that helps to explain their development as musicians and composers. Personal literacy. Anti-Stratfordian position, no evidence that William of Stratford could do more than write his name, no letters, notes, other writings, except for his will, that are attributable to him. And here are the representations of the 6 accepted signatures, accepted, should be in quotation marks because they're not completely accepted. Jane Cox, for example, doesn't accept that the William of Stratford signed these, and it's been suggested they were forged by lawyers, which was not uncommon in the 16th, 17th centuries. The Stratfordian position, defenders of William of Stratford say the evidence is lost. Plays and sonnets and long poems are all the evidence we need that he could write. There's your evidence. Again, a circular argument, because what we're looking at is whether he wrote them. And then they add hand D. Hand D is very important for the Stratfordians. And Ross Barber says these identification of Shakespeare's handwriting seem to have been motivated by attempts to shut down the authorship question. And there's no evidence that this handwriting belongs to William of Stratford. The Oxfordian position, well, Edward Oxenford, which is his name that his poetry sometimes published under, was a writer. He was well known, but published nothing in his name after 1586, when he began to receive a yearly stipend of £1,000 from Elizabeth I. And that's been talked about, I think, probably in other presentations at this conference. And Venus and Adonis appears 7 years later. And Alan Nelson is quick to point out that De Vere left no will. Kurbskii, no works in his hand. German scholar Inga Auerbach asserted that he dictated his works. That's why there's nothing in his hand. Francis Thompson, who noted linguist, said that Kurbskii had the idea for a translation project, but he made the translation with the aid of assistants trained in Latin. So the idea is that Kurbskii directed the translation project and then was given credit for him. But as pointed out before, no contemporary describes Kurbskii as a writer. Relevance. Well, significant relevance, but depends to a great extent on what's being written. Homer may have been blind. So I don't, presumably he didn't write down the songs he was singing, and as well as medieval troubadours. They depended on their memory. Muhammad was illiterate, but at some point someone wrote down their creations. Kurbskii's letters and other compositions could have been dictated. There's the translation project that he directed. That's entirely possible. But it's highly unlikely that Shakespeare's works were dictated. Okay, education. Anti-Stratfordian position. There is no evidence William of Stratford went to school. The Stratfordian position is he could have attended the grammar school in Stratford-on-Avon, and grammar school education was very good in England in those days. So Diana Price said, okay, well, let's look at grammar school education. And she examined all the evidence that we have for grammar schools and put together this list of excerpt of works that were taught anywhere in any grammar school in England. We don't know what was taught at the Stratford School, but elsewhere, and not all of these were taught in any one school. However, she also looked at all the works that were cited or referred to in the Shakespeare canon and said there are a whole lot more. For example, there are these and these and these and these, over 250 of them, that could not have been the result of a grammar school education, no matter how good the grammar school was. Okay, education, the Oxfordians point out De Vere received his bachelor's degree from Cambridge, master's in law from Oxford, and Alan Nelson dismisses these as honorary degrees. Kurbskii, no evidence he had an education. Relevance depends on what's being discussed. Letters and memoirs, again, do not require an education as such, could be dictated. Literary works that integrally borrow from other literary works of the time require that the author be not only literate, but have a substantial education. And with the Shakespeare works, we have that condition. So the person really does need to be literate and have a substantial education. With the Kurbskii works, as I said, there are possible explanations that do not require his having been educated. Specialized knowledge. Anti-Stratfordian position is the plays exhibit specialized knowledge in various fields. It's accurate knowledge, this is 11 of the plays are based in Italy, and the information in the plays about those cities and places is accurate, as Richard Grove researched and pointed out. Stratfordian position is, well, William of Stratford could have seen plays as a youth with such information in them. You know, there were traveling companies from Italy that came through Stratford. He might have seen one of those plays. And those allusions, you know, to various things like falconry and tournaments and all that stuff, the law, that's just smattering of lore that he could have picked up anywhere, a local pub, talking to visitors from Italy, browsing bookstores in London. It's an illusion of knowledge, no big deal. The Oxfordians point out that the Earl of Oxford, university education person of high birth, knew Latin, French, and Italian, traveled to the Italian cities described in the plays, had a law degree, engaged in falconry, and so forth and so on. So the Earl of Oxford, and I'm not saying that he was the only one, I'm just using him as representative of all the other claimants to the having written the Shakespeare canon. and as has been pointed out, probably every one of those other claimants stands a better chance of having written the Shakespearean canon than William of Stratford did. So the Earl of Oxford, as well as others, Bacon has his proponents, Marlowe has his, Neville has his. All of them have had a better claim to specialized knowledge than William of Stratford. Kurbskii, nothing in the works required specialized knowledge, unless you think translating from Cicero or John of Damascus required specialized knowledge, but then presumably he had people who were doing the translation for him. Relevance depends on the accuracy of the knowledge. A writer can imagine and even obtain a high degree of verisimilitude. And I give a couple of examples in who wrote that, of such cases, with no personal knowledge of something. But the details in the works can provide evidence about the author, who the author is, especially in terms if that information can be confirmed, if it is accurate or not. These are all important clues for the historian and for someone who is doing authorship studies. Autobiographical details. Well, the anti-Stratfordian position is that none of the events or allusions in the plays, sonnets, etc., can be related to events in William of Stratford's life. For example, there's no mention of Stratford in his hometown, none of the Warwickshire dialect, and so forth. Stratfordians say, oh, well, these are works of pure imagination. This is Shapiro. Pure imagination. Absence of autobiographical detail demonstrates what a genius he was. Stephen Goldblatt does say, I think in a footnote in Will and the World, that he noted a mention of a glove in one of the plays, and he said, oh, see, that's autobiographical detail because William of Stratford's father was a glover. So that's pretty slim pickings, if you ask me. Okay, Oxfordian events and allusions in plays can be related to events in the Earl of Oxford's life, and I just provide some examples from Hamlet, but this is by no means limited to Hamlet. Other plays, other writings, the fact that he was lame appears in the sonnets. No evidence that William of Stratford was lame. Kurbskii, no mention of his life in Lithuania in the history of the Grand Prince. Presumably he wrote it in Lithuania when he was in exile, but there's no mention of that. And other claims in the history of the Grand Prince cannot be confirmed. Even his birth date can't be confirmed. So it's all kind of up in the air. It's been argued that the autobiographical information in the preface to Novi Marguerite was not about Andrei Kurbskii, but about another Andrei Yarosław, a Polish-Lithuanian cleric. So relevance. Writers can write works of pure imagination, yes, no doubt about it. But when one has a corpus as large as the Shakespearean corpus, no matter how much a genius, how much the person is revered as a genius, there has to be more than just one mention of a glove being an autobiographical detail. And scholars utilize that information. They do profiling of works to determine who the author could have been. Loney did that for Shakespeare. Roy Medvedev did it to try to determine the author of The Quiet Dawn. And so this is a standard tool, looking at autobiographical details in works. Knowledge of the royal court. Anti-Stratfordian position is the plays demonstrate awareness, the inner workings of courtly intrigue, politics. Almost all the plays are about a royal court someplace. And William of Stratford couldn't have had that knowledge. The Stratfordians say, well, that shows the anti-Stratfordians are snobs, that a commoner couldn't write the plays, and he may have picked up the information at the court, or during his lost years, they are very imaginative in figuring out what William of Stratford did during his lost years. None of it is confirmable at all. The Oxfordian position is Earl of Oxford knew the court very well, knew Elizabeth I, other members of the court personally. Lord Burleigh was his guardian. As Lord Great Chamberlain, Earl of Oxford took part in court ceremonies, so no question of his knowledge of the court. Kurbskii proponents see his description of the Muscovite court to be valuable insider evidence. But the skeptics don't agree, and they find that whatever information is there is questionable and often contradicted by other evidence. For example, the existence of so-called Izbrani Rada, or chosen council, is not confirmed in any other source. He also mistakes court ranks and other problems. So relevance. Specialized knowledge of any kind has to be evaluated closely to determine whether it is the kind of knowledge that can be picked up only firsthand, or through book learning, or from being told by an insider, or imagined. The specific pieces of information can all, oh, well, that was from an insider, or that was imagined, or this is from book learning. But one has to look at the total picture, the accumulation. Was all of this information from imagined or from insiders or book learning, rather than firsthand knowledge of the inner workings of Renaissance courts? Claimed to have written the works attributed to him. Anti-Stratfordian position, William of Stratford exhibited no commercial interest in the printing of the plays. There were pirated editions during his lifetime. He took no legal action against them, although in other less important matters he prosecuted. He was concerned about protecting his property. Stratfordians say, you can't infer anything from that. Few legal documents, business records, the time, the Elizabethan age was litigious, but in the end, they argue, as I'll point out, that the plays belong to the company, not to the playwright. And they point out Oxford didn't claim to have written the works attributed to him either. The Oxfordians say De Vere was a patron of writers and actors himself, but could not claim the plays as his own, and the reason for the pseudonym. Kurbskii, we have no evidence Kurbskii ever claimed to have written anything other than those letters to Ivan the Terrible, which may or may not date to the time of Kurbskii's life. Relevance. Well, actually, relatively low relevancy, especially for areas of the world that are not as well documented as the later Elizabethan and Jacobean England. We have no evidence that any of our candidates, Stratford, De Vere, Elizabeth I, Neville, Francis Bacon, Marlowe, any of them claimed authorship of the works, which is exceedingly odd. Nor do we have evidence of anyone's claiming to have authored the works that are attributed to Kurbskii. Not until much later, not until the Miscellany of Kurbskii from the late 17th century. Ownership or access to books. Okay. Anti-Stratfordian position, no evidence William of Stratford owned any books or manuscripts. His will doesn't mention any, although he does talk about second best beds. Stratfordian position, well, the Elizabethan age was not like ours. They did not keep records the way we do. His manuscripts and personal papers could have been burned in the Globe Fire of 1613, if that's where they were. He could have given away his books by oral bequest, and he may have picked up smattering of knowledge. He didn't need books, in other words. He got them from the bookstores. He was browsing the bookstores, which made the booksellers very happy that he wasn't buying any of the books. The Oxfordian position is Earl of Oxford had access to an extensive Lord Burleigh's library growing up. All these things are primary sources for the plays. The Geneva Bible, his Geneva Bible, has underlinings of passages that appear in the plays and glosses in his own handwriting. Kurbskii does seem to have owned books before he defected, but we know this only from one statement. It's a communication from Prince Alexander Polubensky that he wrote to Yakov Shablykin, in which he said, find out about the books that Kurbskii left behind. Now, we don't know how many they are. We don't know what they are. We don't know if Kurbskii read them or venerated them. We just don't know anything more than this one statement. But it does indicate that he did have books. It's highly relevant for authors who are drawing on the writings of other authors. They require ready and repeated access to the necessary books, like the Geneva Bible. It is just astounding to me that anyone could claim, William of Stratford didn't require access to these books because he was a genius, had a phenomenal memory, and could just pick up things. Somebody told him something. But that is the argument. That is the argument of at least Shapiro makes that argument among the Stratfordians. Contemporary evidence, paper trail. No mention of William Stratford as a playwright, poet, or writer by any of his contemporaries. Seems strange if he was already known as a great playwright in his own time. Great writer doesn't need to have lords and ladies and coaches driving up to his door. That's Schoenbaum's retort. Earl of Oxford, according to the Oxfordian position, solid evidence from his contemporaries that he was recognized as a writer of plays and poetry. Kurbskii, no mention by his contemporaries of his being a writer. Documented mention of a letter from Ivan the Terrible to Kurbskii, and of a rude letter from Kurbskii to Ivan the Terrible. But as was pointed out, we cannot confirm those exterior mentions in other works refer to the letters that we have, the extant letters. Relevance, highly relevant, especially for this period in European history. Correct use of argumentum excellentio. We do expect it. It's like the dog that didn't bark in the adventure of Silver Blaze. And Diana Price, I have her graph or chart here, table here, and showing William of Shakespeare at the bottom with no paper trail, Ben Jonson at the top with 10 items in the paper trail. So what I did was I added two names. I added Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, and Andrei Kurbskii. So Earl of Oxford comes in third on Diana Price's list in terms of paper trail. Andrei Kurbskii comes out penultimate. next to the bottom, but above William of Stratford. Chronology of Compositions. Since a chronologically challenged Olympics. The anti-Stratfordian position, we do not know when any of the plays were written. The dates given in their compositions are all speculative and have been skewed to conform to the biography of William of Stratford. Stratfordian position, Earl of Oxford could not have been the author because 11 of the plays were written after his death in 1604. The sonnets were published in 1609, 5 years after his death. The Oxfordian position is that recent analysis, Kevin Gilberry, I will point out, in collection of articles on all of the plays, comes to the conclusion that none of them are outside the lifetimes of either the Earl of Oxford or William of Stratford. That is, chronologically speaking, either of them could have been the author given the earliest possible date and the latest possible date of any of them. And the Oxfordians point out that the sonnets are dedicated to someone who is ever living, kind of the immortal, which usually refers to someone who's already dead. Kurbskii proponents argue that all the works attributed to him were basically written while he was alive. And anything after 1583, the date of his death, that could not have been written before 1583, those are later interpolations that they argue. And the skeptics say, well, no, you can't do that. You can't, yes, there are such things as interpolation, but you can't say divide up because it does not appear, could not have been written before 1583, that therefore it's an interpolation of a work that was written before 1583. So the relevance, a work whose composition is solidly established in terms of latest possible date, it can exclude claimants, doesn't exclude either the Earl of Oxford or William of Stratford in this case. But when the dates are rejiggered to fit a particular claimant, the biography of a particular claimant, then that dating is not to be trusted. And the Kurbskii proponents argue that what he could have written, he wrote, and what he couldn't have written was an interpolation. It's similar to those who argue that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch, when it was pointed out to them, well, would Moses have written about his own death? Oh, well, that's a later interpolation. Well, would he have written that he's the humblest man alive? Oh, that's a later interpolation. There are interpolations, but they have to be established. They can't be just kind of blanket. Anything that doesn't fit is an interpolation. General principles, and here I'll wrap things up. These are the principles that I talk about in the book. First principle, read the text in question. Don't assume you know what the text says based on what other people say it says. A number of years ago, there was an article about the phenomenon of bullcrit. Bullcrit is people going to cocktail parties and having read reviews of the latest book, say Woodward's Rage, and then spouting off as though they had read the book. That's bullcrit. Well, scholars sometimes, I don't mean to cast aspersions, but I think we all to a certain extent might be guilty of that. One exception I can think of is Igor Shevchenko, who was professor of Byzantine studies at Harvard University. And he once told me that whenever someone points out something in Byzantine studies, a primary source in Byzantine studies that he hasn't read, he starts to get sick to his stomach because he prided himself on having read every primary source related to Byzantine studies. Uh, I think that might be a bit unusual, but do your best. Become familiar with the work. Do read the text. Keep an open mind. Avoid premature cognitive closure. I tell my graduate students when they begin their research papers, just assume that what you think now is the case is wrong. That will leave you open to not trying to push through your preconceived notions, but open to that you a better conclusion. Follow the evidence. Don't try to make the evidence conform to your prefiguration, as Hayden White would say. Be analytical. Avoid unquestioning acceptance of assertions, especially your own preconceived notions. The fifth, when the broad brushstrokes and the short brushstrokes are in conflict, favor the short brushstrokes. And what I mean by this, broad brushstrokes are narratives. They're the story. They're what one expects from human behavior. Oh, I don't think a human being could do that. Well, if the short brushstrokes, the forensic evidence, for example, the textual evidence tells you that that person did that, then they did it. I mean, probably they did it. It's as simple as that, and it goes for authorship studies as it does for criminal cases as well. Look for the forensic evidence. Sometimes it may be tedious to go through, but that's where the answer lies. Consider whether an argument or the point one wants to make is applicable to other authorship attributions. And I'm focusing here specifically on the Stratfordian complaint that the anti-Stratfordians are snobs. I mean, not only, but this is one example. Would you apply that to other authorship controversies? So anytime there is two possible authors, an aristocrat and a commoner, and some people favor the aristocrat as the author, is it applicable to say, oh, that shows you're a snob because you don't think the commoner could have written? I also discussed this in regard to attributions to Heloise, specifically in the chapter on Abelard and Heloise in the book. And then finally, be familiar with other authorship attributions and controversies. Get out of the silo. You're now an expert on your own particular authorship controversy. Look at other authorship controversies. They may provide insight. They might be helpful to you, and they might point out things that you are thinking incorrectly. It's better to be well-informed than not. So it's not the end of the story, but it is the end of the lecture. Again, thank you very much for your patience and best wishes.